Hello Summoners, and welcome back to the Mobalytics tier list Q&A for patch 8.18. Our first question this week from YouTube is coming from Jace Damon, who said, "Hey, you didn't mention Nunu in Willump at all. I know his win rate is still low, but if you can control his snowball well, he has pretty good ganks with all that CC especially, and not that bad clear speed. He also has a lot of zoning and teamfight potential with his ultimate. I'm just wondering why he was not mentioned at all." I think that is a fair question, but Nunu and Willump are currently on the weaker side of things. Though their ganks are good, especially lane ganks, people just haven't truly found the best setup yet, or currently the best way to close out games, which is causing his win rate to somewhat be lower than expected. Maybe what we need to do, and we're definitely considering this for the future, is bumping up the learning curve. I genuinely don't think that this Nunu and Willump is a simple champion at all. I think average probably is more appropriate, so the learning curve is most likely somewhat, it's just hard to use the snowball, and especially the E and the ultimate is just a little bit weird to use. It's a personal opinion due to people not truly utilizing the snowball correctly to the highest degree yet, but overall is the champion terrible? No, it's just not the best for climbing. We also got a question saying, "I would love to know how you would rank Rost and Shadow Assassin. I believe putting Kayn in one tier is a bit harsh, as you spend most of the game in your form and they are two completely different champions with two completely different playstyles." While that is absolutely true, he is a champion with two different styles, but it would be no different than if you ranked full damage Lee versus tank Lee Sin in separate categories, which just wouldn't really make any sense. Both Rost and Shadow Assassin have their place in solo queue, one being better than the other, sometimes and most of the time is only based off of team comp and not really the strength of the form. Though Rost is used more, this is simply because he's easier to execute of the two, and tanks are more common at the moment. I would say that if you want ease of difficulty, that is more fair, meaning that maybe Kayn should be in the same tier altogether, but maybe Shadow Assassin is harder to play and has a higher learning curve than Rost. We would think that's pretty fair, so if you agree with that and think maybe that's how it should be, then we definitely wouldn't disagree. We also had a couple questions this week from our Instagram. The Dodge Man wants to know, "Hey, I was always told that if it works in high elo, it will work in low elo. I'm not sure why there would be such a difference between the two." Now, this is something I would say is just a misconception entirely. I wouldn't necessarily agree or say that this is really the case. I think a good example would be a champion like Tahm Kench, for example. Tahm Kench sees the most amount of play in pro play and competitive play, and even in high elo solo queue really just isn't that popular, but is even worse in lower MMRs. Tahm Kench is a champion that requires good coordination and basically gives your professional level 80 carry at the top level of play a free QSS constantly throughout the game, and that's what makes him so darn good. The thing is that for solo climbing, even in high elo, you still do see a difference between these champions because as far as Tahm Kench goes, saving a professional or challenger ADC in a solo queue game is going to be more beneficial than saving and constantly helping a bronze one. The difference between high elo players and low elo players is just so massive that even the game itself is different and changes completely. Champions who are incredibly viable and we would recommend for any low elo player to play, like Garen for example, is just completely terrible in higher MMRs simply because the players are good enough to know how to play around it. Whereas other champions who have such a high learning curve and high mechanical ceiling, something like Ryze for example, is just worse and worse and worse the lower and lower you go. Same thing with a champion like Nidalee. Gerard Center wants to know, what role has the biggest impact towards the game as a whole for carrying in solo queue? This is a very interesting question, and I'm glad this is something that you chose to ask because this changes all the time, right? I mean, even last year we had the Ardent Sensor meta where it was very bot lane focused. We've had metas that are entirely carry jungle focused with things like Lee Sin, Kha'Zix, Rengar, Graves, stuff like that. And we've had very mid focused metas with super hard carry mid laners and assassins, things like Talon and Zed. So it's hard to say right now. However, I will give you a rule of thumb and something you can live by currently. At lower tiers and lower MMRs, the solo lanes do very well. Aside from tank junglers, carry junglers just don't have the performance in lower MMRs at the moment. Solo lanes like top lane and mid lane do very well, and the fact that you can play easier champions and still be very successful, again, things like Garen or Sion are fantastic for climbing in top lane, and things like mid lane for LeBlanc and high elo or Lux and low elo, these champions have a lot of agency and carry potential in solo queue. However, the higher elo you go, the priority of things like support, ADC, and jungle start to replace a bit of top lane and a bit of mid lane, but if you want overall balance, I would say at the highest MMRs, it's pretty reasonable to climb with all 5 positions at the moment. Moving on to questions from Discord, Bad Luck Charm wants to know, do one-trickable champions work well no matter how strong or weak they are? Definitely an interesting and unique question. I would say you need to take the context of just how good or just how weak they are. A good example would be Aurelia right now. Although she is on the high elo for climbing tier list and she's going to see pro play at Worlds, she's a fantastic champion. The only thing is that while she's not on the low elo tier list, if you were playing her in silver or gold and you were working just fine with her and you were able to win your games, then there's no way that we can't recommend her for you, because the reason that she's on the high elo one is not only is she good in high elo, but the player skill and the meta is really important as well, and just how hard the learning curve is for the champion. And lastly, we have a question from the blog. At what point should I start using the high elo tier list? I'm currently mid-plat, so which one should I use? This sort of goes back to what we were just saying in regards to Aurelia, so I think it's a good way to finish off the video. The high elo list is more about your skill level and the learning curve of the champion than it is specifically about the meta of high elo. While they're both taken into account, the most important thing is if you are a mid-plat player and you feel like you have the mechanics and the game sense to play any of the high elo champions, then that's going to be ideal for you since they yield a greater reward when played well. If you don't see success on the higher elo champions, then it's okay to switch back and start playing more simple champions. Platinum is hard because it's somewhat of the crossroad, so depending on the player, they may or may not be ready to make the switch. It's no different than Diamond. You don't necessarily have to stop playing the champions on the low elo list. I mean, pretty much all the way up until Masters or Challenger, you're gonna be okay, and if you still see success, there's not going to be a huge issue. It's just a rough estimation of what could be better due to the fact that it's assumed, of course, that if you're Diamond, you're going to be a better overall player mechanically and game sense wise than a bronze one. Alright, that's going to wrap it up for the Mobalytics patch 8.18 tier list Q&A. Make sure you tune in next week for next week's 8.19 tier list, which is the patch that Worlds is going to be on, so it will be very exciting. Follow us on all of our socials and use the product at mobalytics.gg.